Hey everyone, it's Mike Shooten from ARP Canada, along with my colleague Levi Minderhout. This is the fifth episode of a BC election podcast that we've been doing. Thank you to everyone who's been watching. We have been getting some feedback, so that's encouraging to know that people are
Mhm.
watching the podcast, listening to it, and it's of some help as we move ever closer towards Election Day coming up this week, Saturday, October 19th. As you can see, this episode is slightly different in the sense that Levi and I are not together in the same room. In fact, I'm in Alberta, in Edmonton, just a couple kilometers away from West Edmonton Mall. We're preparing for a presentation tonight in the Providence Canadian Reformed Church. This is part of the ARPA Canada Fall Tour as we swing through Alberta. And as an aside, we were pushing the advanced polling in the last number of episodes, and certainly my wife and I did that because we knew we weren't going to be in BC this coming Saturday. So hopefully, if you're not able to vote, you have already. And if you haven't voted yet, be sure to get out on October 19th. Just a quick recap of what we've been trying to accomplish through these podcast episodes. The first one, we sort of just set the landscape as far as where things are at as we entered this election. We did a bit of a historical lesson in the sense of going back to 2020, what happened after the last provincial election. In each episode, we've done some campaign updates, some highlights of things that have transpired throughout any given week. We started reviewing the different parties' platforms. The only one we haven't really reviewed yet is the BC Conservatives platform because they hadn't released it until this week. So this week, we're going to be touching on that, certainly. We recapped a little bit the leaders' debate, both the radio one on CKNW, as well as the televised debate, which happened last week. And as we start every episode, Levi, I think it's always good to know, are things still close? We've been talking about it throughout the last 4 weeks, that it's very close between the NDP and Conservatives. What are some of the projections as we enter these last few days of this campaign, Levi?
Yeah. Well, and before I get to there, you mentioned advanced voting. I saw that there has been a higher number of advanced votes cast this election than any other election. I think I saw there's already been about 1 million votes cast out of an entire population of like 5
Oh,
million.
wow.
So it seems like a lot of people are heading out to the polls, which is a good sign for turnout. So hopefully everyone else gets out to the polls this Saturday and cast their ballot.
Yeah, that's really encouraging. We've
Yeah.
been talking about it a lot, right? The importance of voting and how, the trend is downward, less people voting every election. So that's really encouraging. Good to
Yeah.
hear.
But kind of projections or how things are shaping up. In the last week or so, pretty much every single polling company has the NDP ahead by a couple of percentage points, and then has them projected to win more seats. The one exception is Main Street Research, which is one polling group, and unlike most of the other pollsters here in BC, they're doing a poll basically every single day here in BC, and they consistently have the Conservatives ahead by 5 or 6%. So there's still some discrepancies between some different polling organizations about who is ahead. So at the very least, it means it's a competitive race and that it could be anyone's election still. It does seem that the NDP still has a slight head start, like are projected to win a few more seats. The last projection that I had seen is 49 seats for the NDP and 42 for the Conservatives. But those are just projections, and they come true or do not come true based on how many people show up to the polls.
Mhm.
And some of the most close ridings are actually in some of the ridings that all of you are in. Uh, Ridings like Chilliwack and Cultus Lake, which is, I think, the riding you're in,
Yep.
Abbotsford Mission, the riding that I'm in, Langley Willowbrook, Langley Walnut Grove, Surrey Cloverdale. Those are five of the ridings that are really up for grabs this election, and those ridings are going to largely decide which party is going to win government. So if you guys are out in those ridings and those super competitive ridings, make sure you go out and vote, get involved there. I mean, regardless of where you live, get out and cast your
Mhm.
ballot. But in those ridings in particular, your ridings might make a particular difference this election.
Mhm. So two things here, Levi. When you look at those projections, are there any projections that give the independents any seats?
I think I saw one projection in the last week that had one independent winning a seat. But I think it was just that one single one. Almost every single projection or poll says that the independents don't have enough support to win a seat, but it's really hard to kind of come up with a projection with based on independence and really local factors. So it's still very much possible.
Well, I'm rooting, I'm rooting for those independents. As people who have been watching will know, we have Levi's conducted a bit of an internal contest within ARPA Canada where staff were able to give their own projections as to what they think will be the end result. And I'm rooting for two independents.
Yeah,
And
you
we'll
are the
see.
only one who has faith in those independents. So,
I think it would just make it fun if the independents could have some influence and maybe even hold the balance of power,
oh,
depending
it
on
would
how
absolutely be
close.
wild. But what
Yeah.
would be entertaining or wild is different than what I think is probable. So,
All right. So we'll see. We'll see. And on that note, be sure to follow us because on Monday, the 21st, Levi and I hope to do one final podcast where we recap. And obviously by that time, if all things go well, we'll know the results of the election and we'll know whether or not two independents actually were successful, as well as a lot of other recap and analysis during that podcast. So looking forward to that one too. And we'll be together in the same office at that time. Just connected to that last point, though, before we get into the platform update from the BC Conservatives and their policies that they've put forward this past week, when it
mhm.
comes to those tight ridings, Levi, we've heard back from a lot of our viewers that they're following this. They are interested. Some of them have even attended the all candidates debates.
Mhm.
Some of them have noticed that there's been an absence of, in particular, BC Conservative candidates from those all candidates debates. Any thoughts there on why the Conservatives would be absent? Is this a good thing for democracy? Yeah, what's your perspective on all candidates seemingly just skipping the debates?
Yeah, one of the local news organizations here in the Fraser Valley, they're called the Fraser Valley Current, and they get all their information out on their websites and through a newsletter. They actually put a really good article together, and they actually had gone and asked all the conservative candidates and all the candidates who actually didn't end up showing up. There were some Green candidates and other ridings as well, some independents and others as well that didn't show up, but mostly, like you said, predominantly BC conservative ones. And so they asked these candidates, well, how come you didn't show up for these all candidates debates? And those candidates' responses was basically, well, we didn't think it was really a good use of our time. We need to go out door knocking to connect one-on-one with voters. We need to still raise money for the campaign. And they just generally didn't think that that would be an effective use of time. And to some degree, I could see that. So, like the one all candidates debate that I was at, where all the candidates were there was only about 120 people there. So, not a huge number of people. But I still don't think at the end of the day that it's very good for democracy for candidates not to come out to these all candidates debates because that's one of the very few opportunities that most people have the opportunity to see their candidate in action, whether they're competent or not, whether they make good arguments, whether they're a person of character, and just generally get to know their candidate whatsoever. So it is one of those few times where people can actually see their candidate in action. And so I do think it's disappointing when people don't have those opportunities to go
Mhm.
see that candidate.
Mhm. Yeah, yeah, I think I would agree with pretty much that assessment. I think I would also add that at the all candidates debates, and I know this even from my own experience when I ran as a candidate in an election well over a decade ago now, that is one platform where the media shows up. So the media is there reporting on it, and yeah, there's a certain level of yeah, campaign anxiety, nervousness when it comes to the media there and what candidates will say or not say, and then also how that's going to be reported. So there is, I have a little bit of sympathy for the BC Conservative Party. This is a party that is, risen to popularity in a very relatively short amount of time. So clearly their screening process for candidates probably has not been as detailed and in depth as some of the other parties. And yeah, there's just a bit of nervousness there. And I do think that the candidates who are able to do a lot of door knocking, like some of these candidates will knock on between 5 and 10,000 doors in one campaign, that those one-on-one conversations are going to be probably more impactful than that room, like you said, of 120 people during an all candidates debate. But I do think you're right in the sense of, our theme of talking about we need to find ways for more people to be involved in these general elections, not less.
Mhm.
It doesn't help when they don't show up at the one kind of public forum, the public event that's being held by a chamber of commerce or whatever
Yeah.
during the election campaign. All right. Well, it remains to be seen how that's going to impact the outcome on Saturday. But let's move into, yeah, the BC Conservative Party took seemingly forever to release their platform. They have now. What are some of the key things that we want to note out of there, Levi, and especially in particular things that might apply to issues that ARPA Canada deals with regularly?
Yeah. Yeah. So basically, this platform was more or less like collating or bringing all together the announcements they've made in other parts so far. But some of the last policy planks that they did come out with over the long weekend, the Thanksgiving long weekend, was on education and was on what they call the next generation of reproductive health care. So when we hear
Mhm.
reproductive health care, that always raises our eyes because oftentimes that mentions abortion.
Mhm.
But in this particular one, when it comes to reproductive health care, they didn't talk about abortion whatsoever. They already said the BC Conservatives did that they were not going to touch the issue. And so while there's nothing there on abortion per se, they did mention one semi-pro-life policy in that they would offer 1 month of paid compassionate leave for women who suffer from miscarriage. So not directly recognizing the life of a preborn, but there is some tacit acknowledgement that there is some loss there,
Mhm.
loss that a woman needs to recover from, and to potentially mourn. So that's yeah, have some pro-life undertones. It can be get some direction into recognizing life of the preborn. But another policy that was in that next generation of reproductive healthcare was the topic of IVF. Now,
Mhm.
IVF is in vitro fertilization, and it's, in my opinion, it's one pro-life issue that it very much deals with preborn human lives in very real ways, but that often gets very little attention from the Christian community. And so it was notable that not the BC Conservatives, they offered to fund a second round of IVF treatment for women for women who are having trouble getting pregnant and want to use assisted reproduction techniques to do that. The NDP already in the last few years said they would fund the first round of that. So they took the first step in expanding access to IVF in the province, and the BC Conservatives want to go another step further. Now, the reason why I think that's notable is there's some discussion in the broader Christian community about whether assisted reproduction in general, like the very act of, for instance, taking a donated sperm, a donated egg, joining them together in a petri dish to create an embryo, a human embryo, which we would believe as Christians is already a human being, and then planting that into a mother, whether that separation of procreation from sex is appropriate and ethical. So there's some discussion, ethical problems there. But probably the bigger problem with IVF is that there are all sorts of ancillary or secondary evils that are a part of the whole IVF industry. Things like freezing of embryos. So that's freezing human beings so they don't grow or develop. They just get suspended in
Mhm.
time. There is often the selective abortion of excess children. If there are too many children created and implanted in the womb that start growing and then the woman doesn't want them, some of those are aborted later on. There's
Mhm.
experimentation on embryos to make IVF possible and realistic, and it has a pretty high failure rate. So only about 25% of the time is IVF successful, and 70% of the time, 75% of the time or so, does it end up with the death of the embryo. So already there's some quandaries about at what point does a practice become so dangerous to human life that it's not ethical. So there's all sorts
Mhm.
of ethical concerns about IVF. And so we've had some policy recommendations in our policy report on IVF, mostly about commercializing or selling or producing or transferring gametes, eggs, sperm, and less about the embryos themselves. But it is something that we just want to bring to your attention because it is a topic that we don't talk about or think about very much as a pro-life community.
Mhm. Yeah, I think in addition to the ethical challenges that it presents that you just spoke to, it this might be an opportunity for us to, like even within ARPA Canada, to initiate a bit more dialogue. Like ARPA Canada has a policy report on IVF. We have a one pager on IVF, but I would put it in kind of in similar sort of area as contraception. Like we, especially as a reformed community, we just don't talk about these things, but we should. I think we should talk about them. And maybe the fact that the BC Conservatives had put this in their platform, building on, as you said, what the NDP has already done in regards to IVF, that's reason for us to maybe just even within the province of BC, try to initiate more dialogue about this so we get a better
Mhm.
understanding of yeah, exactly what's going on here. I remember a few years ago, I read a book from a good friend of mine, Stephanie Gray Connors. It's called Conceived by Science, where she really delves into this topic of IVF and how, yeah, artificially separating children from parents, because oftentimes IVF uses donor sperm, donor
Mhm.
eggs, and then, yeah, some of the problems, even with genetic testing before the embryo is implanted into the womb. And I think we need to give thought to that as
Yeah.
Christians.
Well, and south of the border, forgive me if I, or correct me if I've been wrong, but there was actually a court ruling from a judge in Alabama, I want to say, or somewhere in the southern United States that actually ruled that these frozen embryos were human beings, and they were prompting legal changes and ethical discussions about when human life begins. And so that was a conversation, and those are conversations that are happening south of the border as well.
Mhm.
They haven't really spread here yet for us to talk about this very much, but I remember listening to a couple episodes of Al Mohler's podcast, The Briefing, where he talks about basically this exact point that IVF has a lot of pro-life and um, family implications. And so we should be definitely concerned and thinking about this as Christians, be able to respond to it Christianly. Yet it isn't an issue that we've devoted all that much attention to, unfortunately.
Mhm. Yeah. Yeah, I don't remember all the particulars of that, but I think it had to do with the innumerable number of embryos that have been frozen.
Yeah.
Like you said at the top, we would, from a pro-life perspective, view that already as the initial stages of a human being, and they're frozen in time. What is happening with all those? What will happen to all of them?
Hmm.
I know there is some pro-life organizations that actually focus on adopting embryos,
Yeah.
because that should be something we seek to preserve and save and enhance the life of those human beings that are, yeah, just sitting in coolers and freezers throughout this country. So,
Yeah.
okay. Any other highlights from the platform? You talked about they did touch on education. They also touched on some economic policies in regards to, are they going to increase the deficit? Are they going to keep putting forward deficit budgets, add to our debt, our provincial debt? What's their plan there?
Yeah.
Anything that you can share with us, Levi?
Yeah, there were some definitely notable ones from our Christian community on education. So they did promise and I'm just going to quote directly from the platform, listen to parents who choose to homeschool about what can be done to remove barriers to homeschooling and enhance support for home learners. So exactly what that means, we don't know. But they were the only party to mention homeschooling in their platform and seemed to be relatively friendly towards it. So that should be good news for anyone who homeschools their kids in the province or is interested or are pro homeschooling. They also promised to reverse some funding cuts to NDP to independent distributed learning schools and help them to get to more funding that be on parity with public schools. So that is something that is relatively important for people who I mean, independent or distributed learning programs are kind of like a hybrid between an actual school, because they are an actual school, but they're all online and they often direct education for people who learn at home. So they're kind of homeschoolers, but they're registered with an online school.
Mhm.
So that could impact homeschooling independent school sector a little bit as well. But then specifically for brick and mortar independent schools, they promise both to give more flexibility to independent schools to have flexibility with their curriculum, which is good because we've seen more and more intrusion in the governments on some of this really small decisions that schools get to make. So a little bit more freedom in that regard is particularly important. And intriguingly, they also promise to work with local governments to expedite approvals of new independent schools. And this is definitely interesting because I can just speak from some personal experience, like some of the Christian schools here in the Fraser Valley have been looking to expand or purchase a new property or build a new building build a new school, but they're having difficulty finding that land and making that happen. So it would be interesting to see what if elected, what the Conservative government would do to help more schools open their doors.
Mhm.
And then just quickly, and the last thing they promised on education that's kind of notable for the reform community, not for independent schools, but they officially committed to removing SOGI, so the sexual orientation, gender identity policies, teaching resources, lesson plans, infrastructure from schools. So that was something that some specific conservative candidates were very vocal about already, but it became official party platform when they just released it earlier this week.
Mhm. Yeah, that one appears to be huge. And I when I first saw that, I was like, is that just virtue signaling to some component of your base, or how would that work? But yeah, then when you see some of the candidates, even higher profile candidates who have come over from the BC United, speaking into this specific topic and highlighting
Yeah.
just some of the resources that are being used in schools to advance this particular gender ideology. It's encouraging. I find it encouraging. I think it's a huge undertaking to try to remove that from schools, just because, as we've talked about and written about in the past, it's not just like one curriculum that gets taught at a specific time. It's an ideology, like you said, that's embedded
Yeah.
in so many aspects of the education system. But good on them for sticking to that. We talked about John Rustad and Bruce Banman using their time in the legislature as conservative MPs or MLAs, sorry, to highlight
Yeah.
this. They've maintained that throughout. So good on them for that. And yeah, we'll see what happens after Election Day.
Hmm.
All right.
Well,
Okay, we should. Oh,
I'll
you
just,
wanted to add one more thing?
yeah, I will just quickly mention because you mentioned kind of the financial or fiscal promises in there. Not that that's something we follow too much at ARPA, but I just wanted to note it because generally we associate left of center political parties like the NDP or Greens to be more interested in running in deficits and less interested in balancing the budgets. But both of those parties came up with costed platforms and said that although they would run deficits kind of in the near future, their election platforms weren't planning to increase those deficits all that much. The Conservatives, though, they said they're in their platform they'd be spending another $2.3 billion in new spending, cutting taxes by $4 billion in the next 2 years. So they're going to get even larger deficits in the next couple of years than the other two parties.
Hmm.
So that was interesting, but they did commit to balancing the budget within 8 years of being elected, which is quite a time
Wow.
frame. And they claim to do it because they want to get more revenue from just simply growing the economy. They think they can grow the economy out of the deficit and the bad situation that BC is in, and they claim they can do that by growing. One of the numbers in their platform was 5.4%. They think they can grow the economy that fast per year, and it'd be fantastic if that actually happened. But I will note that's faster than any year in the last 25 years of BC history, except for like the 1 year just coming out of the pandemic, which was an anomaly. So the Conservatives in their platform are promising and banking on basically having the best track record for economic growth in BC in the last 25 years. So it's going to be a tall order. It'd be fantastic if it actually happened, but it also might smack of being somewhat unrealistic as well. So I just wanted to highlight that as well.
Okay. Good. Well, thanks for taking a look at that and sharing that with us. Yeah, it's better late than never in the sense that we were hoping to be able to talk to some of these things much earlier on,
Yeah.
but thankful that they actually did release their platform in time for election day this coming Saturday. All right, as we wrap this up, we want to do so by encouraging all of you to get out and vote on October 19th on Saturday. Every vote is going to make a difference. As Levi said off the top, it is close. Some polls have the NDP on top, some of the BC Conservatives on top. Obviously, there are some key independents who are also running in this election. So be
Yeah.
sure to get out and vote. If you have an opportunity, maybe some of you have been doing this already, to volunteer for a candidate. They're going to need a lot of volunteers on election day when it comes to getting out the vote. There's a lot of door knocking that goes on, a lot of telephone calling that goes on throughout that day.
Mhm.
So if you have opportunity, be sure to do so. I think Levi, you had a challenge to people in BC when it came to volunteering. What was that challenge? Was it a certain amount of hours, wasn't it?
Oh, it wasn't anything in particular, but it just was a challenge to go out and spend some time. We talked about this at the fall tour. Go out and spend some time volunteering for the local candidates, because it all helps. I mean, by the time you hear this, probably on Saturday morning, it's going to be a pretty tight timeline to yet go help and volunteer, but maybe there's still an opportunity. And the reason that volunteering and voting yourself is important, of course, is because, like, yeah, like you said, every vote makes a difference. Just a couple elections ago in 2017, the election was won by just a single vote or a single seat in the legislature. And that seat, or one of the seats, the closest margin was 189 votes. So for the lack of 189 votes, or because of 189 votes, that determined whether BC had a BC Liberal government or a BC NDP government at the time. So there's 5 million people in British Columbia. That seems like a lot. But when you really get down to how our electoral system works, sometimes it just takes 10, 15, 100 votes to actually swing the results of an entire election. So, in case you think that your vote necessarily won't go very far, think again, because it very well could decide the fate of your riding, the election, all sorts of things. So, finally, friends,
Good.
everyone else to go hit the polling stations too.
All right. Okay. Yeah. And as we've highlighted, the voter turnout is dropping consistently. It's fallen. Levi figured it out. Over the last 40 years, it's fallen from 78% of eligible voters voting to an average of 54% of eligible voters. So um, you indicated that over a million, you had heard over a million votes have been cast through the advanced polling. So maybe we're going to see that number, that 54%, is some improvement on that during this election. And we certainly hope that the Reform community shows up to vote on October 19th on Saturday. And we
Mhm.
really look forward to touching base with you again on Monday. Monday, October 21st, we're going to be recording our final episode covering the BC election. And we look forward to talking about the results and recapping them. And yeah, having some thoughts on what BC is going to look like for the next 4 years.
Yeah.
So until then, thank you so much again. Thanks so much for watching. And please do, share this information with other people that might be in your spheres of influence. And if you have any questions, be sure to email them to Levi at arpacanada.ca.
Okay. Take care, everyone.